Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, although virtually, but we're very glad to welcome you. My name is Lena Strupinska, and I'm the Deputy Director for Studies at the Institute of International Relations. And I'm very glad to host and moderate this very relevant and very important discussion on divergent European views and divergent European responses to the war in Ukraine. As our viewers very well know, Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine has upended the European security order as we know it, and has resulted in the largest war in Europe since 1945. And Russia's aggression might come unexpected to some in the West, although definitely not for the Baltic states, who have long been vocal and sounding the alarm about Putin's aggressive intentions. It is partly, of course, because of our shared history and shared understanding that the Baltic states even today are among the loudest speaking to the international community and asking for more to be done to address what is going on in Ukraine. And precisely because of this, we invited security and international relations and Russia experts from 3 Baltic states. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Dr. Toms Rostoks, Director of the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy in Latvia, Associate Professor at the University of Latvia, an expert of NATO-Russia relations and VU relations with its eastern neighbors. Hello, Toms. Kalev Stoicesu, a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security in Estonia, a former diplomat and official from Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Affairs, but currently a research fellow. Also an expert in Russia's foreign and domestic policy, military developments, economy, media, regional security, defense, and deterrence. Also our very own Associate Professor Margarita Šešelgytė, the Director of the Institute of International Relations, and expert in European foreign and security policy, security, defense, international relations, and foreign policy analysis. And last, but definitely not least, Professor Brandon Sims, Professor in the History of European International Relations and Director of the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University, Professor Brandon Sims. He's an expert on European geopolitics, past and present, and his principal interests are in Britain and Europe, humanitarian intervention, and state construction. I left Professor Sims for last on purpose because I'd like to start the discussion with a reference to the most recent Professor Sims article in the New Statesman that served as a source of inspiration for this discussion. And here I'd like to quote Professor Sims, who said that if I once thought that state quality in Europe improved as you moved from east to west, recent events have shown that our continent is more like a croissant. From UK across Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Poland to Ukraine, we see polities that have mounted a vigorous defense of Europe against its biggest foe, Putin's Russia. But at the heart of our continent, sadly, there's a void without heart or head. So Professor Sims, I would like to start from you and to ask you to please elaborate on the point you were making and talk about the different responses of the European states to the Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and maybe a little bit about the reasons behind such differences.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you to the Institute for International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. It's really good to be on this panel. As you say, I'm an historian of European geopolitics. I'm not an expert on Eastern Europe or the Baltic region. So what I'm going to do is to try and get the discussion going with some geopolitical observations arising out of my piece that you've heralded on the war in Ukraine and what it reveals about Europe today. Now, at the moment, NATO and EU leaders stress their so-called unity in the face of the Russian threat. But in fact, in practice, we've seen really quite different and diverging responses across the continent, both before and now during the invasion. Before the invasion, and I don't think I'm telling you anything here that you don't already know, it was obvious that there were many European countries that were reluctant to accept that invasion was imminent and to help the Ukrainians to prepare against it. For example, Germany and Italy and other countries, but they refused to countenance swift financial sanctions. They denied the intelligence coming from the Five Eyes, from the Anglo-Americans, predicting the imminent invasion from the Russian Federation. They continued to cultivate an energy dependency on Russia and refused to spend as substantial as they should have done, according to NATO agreements, on maintaining their militaries. Although, of course, it's unfair to say that the Federal Republic of Germany did not spend on the military, because, of course, they funded the military of the Russian Federation very extensively over the past 10 years or so, with all its, indirectly, of course, with all the money for gas. There were a small number of countries who did help: Poland, Sweden, the Baltic states. But actually, the most important helper was not a European Union member. That, of course, was the United Kingdom, which was very far out in advance with the supply of weaponry and the provision of intelligence to the Ukrainians. And this continued after the start of the invasion. Again, even though there was a huge shift within the European Union, in particular also in Germany's professed plans for defense spending, nevertheless, they still continue to buy Russian gas. So every day, including today, millions of German and Italian euros go to feed Mr. Putin's war machine. And the supply of weaponry has been limited or ineffective from some of these countries. And some European countries, EU countries, don't even supply lethal aid, in particular Hungary, as is well known, and indeed my own country, which is the Irish Republic, which has refused to abandon its traditional neutrality. And all of this is not only well known to you, it's been noted by the Ukrainians, in particular by President Zelensky, who in various speeches and in various articles has handed out, if you like, marks to the different European countries. Pretty much at the top is the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Baltic states. Germany, France, Italy, and some other countries are some way behind, and Ireland and Hungary specifically are basically at the bottom of his evaluation. So in the face of all of this, as Nina said, I proposed, only half in jest, shortly after the start of the invasion, my so-called croissant or crescent theory, which sees which was really a rethink, because I'd sort of tended to assume that, as Ina said, state quality improved as you went from east to west, and there are historical reasons for that, of course, if it was true. But actually looking at particularly the Ukrainian resistance, which took me very much by surprise, the vitality that's evidenced by the Ukrainian society and polity, taking that in conjunction with the policies I described in the Baltic states, Poland, Sweden, and the UK, I proposed this so-called croissant or crescent thesis, which saw kind of an arc of robustness stretching from the UK like a sort of banana all the way down to Ukraine. And I contrasted this with what is basically a pretty amoebic center in Europe. It's a kind of almost a vacuum, which is Germany, a country to which, of course, many look for leadership in Europe, have done really for decades, but in particular since the financial crisis. Now, I think there could be many reasons for this. Lena, you kindly invited me to speculate on them, but I wonder whether it might be better if I left it here for the moment, and sort of open it up to see whether the panelists agree with my analysis, and whether this is a good starting point for discussion. And maybe after they've had their say, I could come back with some theories of my own as to why we're once again, because this, of course, is a repeat performance on the part of Germany, once again, there's something missing at the heart of Europe, and it's something that is I think, disabling the overall performance of our continent. But I think I've now exceeded just about my 5 minutes. I look forward to hearing what the others have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Sims. You made a great introduction and mentioned a number of countries and a number of different responses and alluded to certain potential reasons like energy dependence or historical trajectory or other matters. But I think for the clarity of the discussion, it would make sense probably to break down the responses into at least 3 large blocks: political, economic, and military, because they also touch upon at least 3 different kinds of actors: the European Union, NATO, and individual states that reacted on bilateral basis. So first and foremost, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the military response, and NATO's in particular reaction. And here I would like to turn to Kalev and ask to comment further on that response and its effects, both short-term and longer term.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a very timely event. I was prepared rather to make some general comments on the Western reaction to Russia and what's in general. But to your question about NATO, I think the rhetoric is to a certain extent inadequate. Yes, sure, we wouldn't like the conflict to spill over. That's pretty clear. Nobody wants to see war more than or it already is on the territory of Ukraine. But we don't have to say that every day, that we're going to stay out, we're not going to do anything to help Ukraine and so on in that sense. And there have been a certain miscommunication, for instance, with the aircraft that was promised and then not promised to Ukraine and so on and so forth. I mean, that was a serious blunder, and that gave a very wrong message both to Ukraine and to Russia. So we have given, of course, serious support to Ukraine, also in terms of defense material and lethal weapons and munitions. But we could and we should do more, but for some reason we don't. I think the most immediate and most urgent task is, of course, stopping Russia's aggression. And the West is more or less unified with regard to supporting Ukraine in what we have offered: economic, humanitarian assistance, and as I mentioned, also weapons and munitions for self-defense. Also on imposing on Russia tougher sanctions, although gradually leaving some room for the future in case Russia continues to escalate. That's the bottom line. One may say that we have made huge efforts, okay, but I think that's not enough. That's not enough to force Russia now to stop the aggression. And I'm afraid that the West gives clear signals of fear over the spillover of the conflict, and I said, and I would mention particularly the White House, as opposed to a certain extent to the State Department and the Pentagon, and also some European countries and leaders. And also there are messages of expressing actually fear of Russian employment of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear. So I think in this regard, NATO, we have a nuclear doctrine. We emphasize certain messages in our communiques and documents regarding the nuclear deterrence. So I think we should give stronger messages from that side. If we don't, that also signals something. And the impression that at least is given to me is that emerges that the West doesn't want to press Putin's regime too hard, which is again something that we don't spell out concretely what is the future of Ukraine, how we see it. Even if the immediate task is to stop the war, we have to have a vision. What are our strategic goals in countering Russia? There are no answers right now. There is no strategy, just reactions. Well, one example, Russia said days ago, maybe a week ago, that they would ask demand from unfriendly countries to pay for the natural gas in rubles. So this is a very blunt example of Putin's game, how he plays it and how he tries to force the West to play along this game. This is not about that they badly need rubles. They have more rubles than they need. They need hard currency. It's about us playing their game. I mean, the Russian ruble is now as strong, and I speak about the exchange rate, as it was on the 23rd of February. Although on the 7th of March, it jumped to 150 rubles per euro. Why is that? Because we are not very consistent, I think, in this sense. So this is the tough game, and the West has to show force and determination. So whatever, we're not enough consistent, as I said, and we don't have a vision, and we maybe even some countries, some leaders are afraid of what may yet to come. It is a Cold War version 2.0. We don't have a Churchill now in the West to spell it out, like Churchill did in Fulton in 1946. There is no way back to a kind of normality, in quotation marks. That is neither possible nor desirable, I think. And we must issue from the Western side clear demands and positions regarding the resolution of this war of aggression in Ukraine, Ukraine's future, and also our relations with Russia. As I said in our preparatory meeting, the goal must be, because there is no other way, to weaken Russia to the extent that it wouldn't pose us a threat in the years to come. This is no time for ambiguity or hesitation, because this only fuels Putin's ambitions and self-confidence. We have to be clear that the sanctions would be there in place until Russia fulfills fully certain demands that we place. I see here a clear kind of a threat that even if Russia would announce just a temporary ceasefire or something, there would be leaders in certain countries jumping out to say, oh, how nice, let's get rid of these and those sanctions, as if the stick and the carrot policy doesn't work, just the stick. Unfortunately, this is how it is. And as I mentioned also earlier in that preparatory meeting, the sanctions are not the only punishments for Russia's behavior. We should speak about the war crimes and the crimes against humanity, and the people responsible should be prosecuted. And thirdly, we should speak very clearly about reparations for Ukraine. It's not the West that should pay for Russia's destruction, but it should be Russia. And that would be a lesson for the future. And that is real deterrence for the future, if Russia would have to pay for that. Russia didn't have to pay much after 2008, after aggressing Georgia. Not that much even in 2014 and so on. Only now we have started to impose on Russia really painful sanctions, but even these are not yet sufficient. And I think if this line is not adopted, Ukraine's future might be very bleak, and Russia would prepare for future aggressions, possibly sooner than we think. I wouldn't like to finish on this pessimistic note, but there are many things that we should be very careful with and try to do better than until now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalev. And you raised an excellent question. I would actually like to use my opportunity to rephrase this and turn it back to our expert panel about the lack of strategy, right? So do we have a strategy? Is there one? And where, if we don't have any, where could it be born, Right. What would be the suitable platform to talk about this? Toms, maybe you would like to comment on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to comment on this. I think that in terms of strategy, we are hampered by having had too little time, because this conflict has turned our reality upside down. I think that there's this one really important aspect which we got wrong. Well, something like, well, in the weeks and months preceding the war, American intelligence gets a lot of praise for getting things right in terms of Russia's intentions, and also in terms of the timing of the attack, and that Russia really was ready to attack, and on such grand scale. That this was not about Donetsk and Luhansk. This was about, you know, the three-pronged attack on Ukraine from north, east, and south. But there's also been an intelligence failure, a big one, and we have failed. I think pretty much everybody failed. We underestimated Ukrainian will and capacity to resist. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence from policy-making circles where apparently Western policymakers thought that once the attack started, that it would be over in something like 48 or 72 hours, and that's it. And also, I think that was the case with the United States. So pretty much everybody got it wrong. Listened yesterday to one podcast, which was recorded one day after the war started. And a well-known political scientist, American, who has extensive experience in American government as well, in high-ranking positions, he was saying that, well, it's just a matter of time, and this will Russian military would overpower Ukrainian military, and Kiev would fall, and so on and so forth. So even though Americans and perhaps the British got a lot of things right about Russia's intentions, but we got things wrong collectively when it comes to Ukrainian will to resist, Ukrainian capabilities, and we also overestimated the power of the Russian military, which sent us scrambling, because once the events started to unfold, we were completely unprepared for what was happening. And it turned out that we had to react to events which we were not able to foresee. So as Carl Bildt, a well-known policymaker, former policymaker, recently explained, Western policymakers are caught in day-to-day events. There's no time to think about strategy. And honestly, even 5 weeks into the conflict, we know so little. Because there's a lot of information. Well, we know some of the things we know quite well. The Russian military is certainly not doing very well. Their war aims have been scaled down, probably, but there's very little information about the present state of Ukrainian military. So I think that both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, think that they could still prevail. They could, Ukrainians could avoid the eastern part being overtaken by the Russian troops, while the Russian military and political leadership probably think that they can still do it. You know, they are so far, it's been a leap in the dark, this war, and they think that they can still accomplish their war aims. So I think that is the reason why there's no coherent strategy. But at the same time, and I'll finish my remarks with this, but at the same time, once the war started, there seemed to be endless opportunities, but it seems that those opportunities have really started to narrow down. In the first weekend after the war started, Germany's security and defense policy, well, there was a revolution. And it really seemed as if anything could happen. I think that we are now in the stage of the war where options are starting to narrow down. There's some path dependency. There's this mantra that no NATO troops will be in Ukraine, no fly zone. So certain things are clearly off limits. And I think that in a few years' time we might come to a conclusion that there were some opportunities that we missed, right? And I think it's for that reason, it's the Baltic states' task to constantly remind other states that, look, even though we think that there are certain things that we should not do, we should probably ask those questions. Well, but maybe there are some opportunities, but we're not seeing them. And maybe those will be missed opportunities, and maybe they'll have a decisive negative effects for the Ukrainian state and society. So, but I think I'll stop here and pass the floor onwards to somebody else.
Thank you. And you mentioned an excellent point about Baltic leadership, because it seems there is a place for Baltic state leadership in the current crisis. And I'd like to turn to Margarita now and to ask about what is our responsibility at the moment, and do we have those strong leaders in the region to bear this burden on their shoulders and to keep the message that we need to do more alive and heard?
Thank you, Lina. I'd like to thank everyone for very interesting insights. I'd like to start a bit with a bigger picture and try to balance the pessimistic and optimistic approach, and then I'll finish with the Baltic responsibility. I very much like the analogy of croissant and the idea of giving marks to the countries, but also it correlates a lot with the theorists saying that the further away Russia is, the less of a threat it poses to the countries. So, the Baltic leadership is very much related as well to the immediate and imminent threat that we are feeling, despite being members of NATO, but for us is crucially important. For others, it's important, but maybe not so imminent. So that's the main driving force of the Baltic behavior, and that's why we are getting very good points, because it's also about us. It's about our future, about our history, and about our future. But taking a step back and trying to balance this pessimistic and optimistic approach, there's always various narratives. There's always this various assessments, and it's either you see the glass half full or you see the glass half empty. And the reaction of the West was very fast. And while talking about the European Union, it took for European Union 40 days to react to the COVID pandemic, whereas in this case, it was only 4 days. So it's an incredible progress how EU reacted. It reacted very fast on a very divisive issue. Russia has always been a very divisive issue in the European Union. At the moment, the unity is very strong, even in terms of the sanctions. Okay, Hungary might be an exception. Otherwise, there is a very clear unity about the sanctions that are in the place and about potential new sanctions. Every option is on the table, and it is still on the table. So it's also a very optimistic perspective of how the EU is reacting. Another important issue that EU is going to take the steps which will have long-term consequences. One of the major problems of the European Union, hampering its ability to act, is a very high dependence on the Russian energy resources of some of the countries. In general, in the case of the EU, it's around 40% dependence, depending on various, resources, either it's oil or gas or coal. And you cannot just cut this dependence overnight, because it's about the functioning of economy, it's about the societies in these countries. But what the EU is doing is taking steps to diminish this dependence. And I think it's very transformational and very important, and will have huge histories on the future ability of the EU to act vis-a-vis Russia more stricter, but also potentially vis-a-vis other potential enemies, adversaries. And it is doing well in a holistic, structural way. For instance, the idea to diminish the dependence on Russia is done in the coordination with the Green Deal, and the initiative Repower Europe is very important in that sense. So there are steps that the EU is taking. There are two taboos which have been broken very fast. That was the agreement to finance the military equipment to the Ukraine from the European Commission money. So first of all, financing defense, and second of all, it's also financing lethal equipment to those countries, Eastern Partnership countries, fighting against Russia. So these things are also very important, and I can just applaud that EU was able to do this. But of course, there are also pessimistic assessments. Too little, too late. Sanctions work, but not entirely. The imposed exclusion from SWIFT is working, but not entirely. Not all the banks are excluded from SWIFT. So there is still money going to Russia, paying for energy resources, and this money is used to finance war. So there are lots of pessimistic also assessments of what's happening. But you know what? I think that there are two main things that we have to take out of this situation. First of all, we have to understand that this conflict is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's going to take a long term. So we have to see the trends, the potential trends, which have an impact in the long run. So today we probably are unhappy that NATO is not giving, the air defense for Ukraine, or the sanctions probably do not show its effects. But let's see transformational things that the EU does. Another important thing to understand in this conflict, that it is not only the war between Ukraine and Russia, it is not only the war of Europe. It is a bigger game, changing the balance of power structure in the world. And we have to also see other players like China, like Gulf countries. What are their attitudes? And they are looking at this war and making their conclusions of where will they be in the future world? What will be the rules of the game? And I think it is very important now what European Union, but also NATO and the United States will show to these countries. So what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I think that long trends and our firm stance on democracy, on the values, it is very important. And Kalev mentioned the punishment for Putin's regime for the crimes of war. I think it is very important, but it is even more important that it is in no way we have to come back to normal, and in no way we have to have deals with Putin after the conflict ends. Putin is a pariah and has to stay like that. Otherwise, we're sending very mixed messages for other countries, other players who might also have some intentions to get some advantages in the changing power balance. And coming back to the Baltic leadership. So I think that we are doing a lot, and we have been doing a lot throughout the years. We were vocal about what Russia is doing and what Putin's regime is about that. So I think that we are doing enough with the resources that we have, because we don't have a lot of resources, and we are small countries. now I think that the expertise that we have is being recognized, and this is important to keep the message sinking in the heads of the other European players that Russia is not changing. It's not. If the war is over, Putin will stay the same. He's learning his lessons, and if we are not punishing the regime, so the next, after several years, we will be facing another crisis, another conflict in Europe, maybe on the NATO's territory, which we really want to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. Indeed, although looking from the perspective of international criminal law, we all understand how complicated this is. And unless there's a regime change, probably even if Putin is charged by the ICC, he may continue living pretty comfy in his cave somewhere in the mountains for years to come. But I'd like to come back to Professor Sims, and I saw you had a remark, and I also would like to ask an additional question about the UK. Although not a member of the European Union after Brexit, UK has also, like the Baltic states, been very vocal about the need for a stronger response. And I would like to hear your insights about how could we stitch the UK back into the political decision-making in the context of this conflict.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to respond first to what Margarita said, and that then leads on to your question. And I completely agree that a large part of the explanation for the Baltic states and for Sweden and Finland is obviously the proximity to Russia. So if Morocco invaded Spain, for example, then perhaps there would be less enthusiasm for a common European front. And that, I think, highlights the point you've alluded to, Lena, which is that the UK, of course, is further away than any other European state, except perhaps, Spain or the Irish Republic, from what's happening, and yet was the furthest in front in terms of overall military commitment, intelligence commitment in helping the Ukrainians. And that, to my mind, and I'm a friend of the European Union, that, to my mind, is a terrible indictment of the European Union, for reasons that ought to be obvious to all of us, that the country which left is the one that is actually the most committed on this question. And it really leads me to what is the root of this, which was something you raised in your opening remarks. Well, it's a little bit like the problem of the United States in the 18th century. So at the moment, we have EU countries, I should say, EU countries who basically take a view on geopolitical threats according to where they lie. So if you're in the Baltic states, you're worried about Russia. If you're in the Mediterranean, you worry about migration. Or you're on the front line and so on. And if you're the Irish Republic, you worry about Brexit. And that seems to me not a strategic way of going about what ought to be union business. So in the United States, if Mexico invades Texas, people in Maine or Massachusetts wouldn't say, well, that's very far away, we don't care. Now, when you look to the 18th century, actually, that was a major argument in the framing of the Union of the United States, where they said we have to have a political union. Otherwise, we'll have exactly these debates, that the southern states will be worried about Spain, the northern states will be worried about Britain, the western states will be worried about the Native Americans and the French and so on. So we have to have one overarching union interest. And so I think what the Russian crisis, the Ukrainian war has revealed is just the sheer extent to which the political construction of Europe is completely unfinished. And we always refer to these events as opportunities. But of course, we've had many opportunities in the past. We've had the financial crisis, we've had Bosnia, we've had the refugee crisis, we've had every conceivable crisis, we had Crimea. And I think Tom's really was implying this, that actually there's a real sense that we may now also waste this crisis, not least thanks to the resistance of the Ukrainians. It's a kind of a paradox. The more the Ukrainians resist, helped by the British and the Americans primarily, the less pressure will be on the mainland Europeans to do what they need to do. That's an interesting paradox, which would be worth exploring a bit more. That brings me to your final question, which is, given that the UK is such an important part, as we have now been reminded, and Europeans had occasionally forgotten since 2016, such an important part of European security, how do we now recognize that Brexit has taken the United Kingdom out of the political framework and decision-making in Europe, not obviously out of the military one through NATO? Isn't there something that we should do to try and bring the UK back into the overall political management of the continent? So, for instance, it makes no sense for the UK to be sending anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainians when the members of the European Union, the Germans, the Italians, are sending millions of euros, hundreds of millions of euros every day, hand over fist, so that Putin can build more tanks. There needs to be some sort of way that the United Kingdom can stop European countries from doing that. So my question for the panel would be, how do you, and please the answer should not be, don't do Brexit, because that has been and gone. And of course, under the previous constitution of the European Union, UK wasn't particularly effective in pushing a containment of Russia policy. So my question would be, how do we address the political lack of construction in Europe, and how do we bring the UK back into the political management of the continent?
A very complicated question to answer. Who would like to give a try? Margarita says, I don't know.
I can always chime in, but yeah, political construction of Europe, it's a very philosophical and broad question. I think that, the European Union has a very good chance to become a really geopolitical player, getting out of this crisis. And it only depends on the European Union. Will it be able to use this crisis as an opportunity, or it's going to be, lost crisis? Why I think so? Because, well, I mentioned the speed of reaction, the unity, the political unity of Europe in terms of supporting Ukraine. The EU, I think it's the biggest donor at the moment for the Ukraine in terms of overall aid. It also showed the willingness to step one step forward with the sanctions, with the tariffs, which was unimaginable before. And the most important, what I also already said, it's these transformational steps in terms of reducing the EU's dependency on Russia for the energy resources. However, saying that, I also have certain doubts and sort of a bit of a pessimistic assessment, because it's going to be a long-term game. I'm a bit afraid if the society of the European Union is ready to play this long-term game. Because when the prices of energy resources would be rising for the months and another month and another month, and the cost of the products that you're using daily will be rising and rising, and there's obviously less food on the table and less opportunities to go for the vacations, the society tends to get tired. And then we will be facing a number of elections in European Union countries. And I don't know what will be the results. And if those politicians, which took a very brave step today, I still applaud the European Union for being brave and fast, won't be punished by the societies. And I think it is very important to educate societies that they will not be so complacent with the situation that we have at the moment. and that they would be able to see the potential threats that dictatorships, authoritarian regimes like Russia, but not only, opposing to the societies.
Thank you, Margarita. Kalev.
Thank you. There are two main issues, two main questions. First, on the UK. Well, personally, it was a tragedy for me as well to see that the Brexit happened, but it's a fact, so we can't reverse that. What I would see is that would be an enhanced, a very close political dialogue between the EU and the UK. Very close cooperation and discussions as much as possible. But I can't see that the European countries would offer to the UK a vote or a veto or something more as not being a member, so to say. I mean, we can take from the part of the EU on board certain British propositions, certain ideas, certain contributions, and so on, but there must be a formula that would fit both sides, but this is the reality. The UK is not any longer an EU member state, so they're not having the same rights and opportunities any longer. Now, if we speak about the EU and NATO, yes, we have done a lot of great things, but we should not forget that very many of these things, these tough decisions that have been made in the past 8 years, let's say, have been made because of Mr. Putin's and his regime's aggressivity and his aggressions. And we were kind of pushed and forced to do certain things. Remember, on the side of NATO, before 2014, there was no presence in the member states from the former Warsaw Pact or the Baltic states whatsoever. With the exception of the Baltic air policing, the 4 aircraft rotating in Šiauliai in Lithuania. That was it. The fact that we came back to the collective defense, to the core task of NATO, that we have leveled this level of security, because before we were in a way a second-rate member state. We were politically members, we were militarily members only in the virtue of participating in NATO operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But there was no NATO presence in our countries. So it was actually Putin who made that possible. Then if we look at the EU and the energy sector, which is vital for the future, and we had even this, if I'm not mistaken, the 3rd chapter and the provisions of EU's agreed energy policy, that we seek to diversify the sources of supply of energy, not to become too much dependent on certain sources. And of course, Russia was kept in mind. And Germany, nevertheless, wanted to import almost 60–70% of its gas from Russia. So basically, Chancellor Merkel's Germany put Russia on top of EU's agreed energy policy. Now it is Putin who actually forces us to seek alternatives and become more independent in that sense. So very many things. I mean, he has done many good things for us too, you know. So I don't know if we should thank him really for that, but sometimes it seems that we are doing very important things that we should do only when there is real pressure behind and we are like forced to do things. So, and it's very reactive from that point of view. We should be more and more proactive. Now, my last remark here is that you mentioned, Margarita, societies and people's how they, I think that in some cases, societies look even more for change and for reforms and certain things to happen than the politicians themselves and the political forces. So one example would be for instance, our northern neighbor, Finland, and probably they will have to come, also Sweden, come out soon with a decision to join or not to join the North Atlantic Alliance. They have missed several trains so far. This might be their last one. Mr. Putin wants to close the door, even if it legally would be open. De facto, it might close for a long time. So, and they understand that very well. I mean, if not even now to make that decision, then when? And if Finland and Sweden would join the alliance, of course, the posture of the alliance would change tremendously in northeastern Europe. So to our good of the Baltic states and Poland and other Nordic countries. So, but the point is that it was unexpected for the Finnish government and the president that after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the opinion polls showed 53% of support for NATO membership in Finland. And in a way, the politicians and the parties were in a panic because they, for many years, they constantly repeated that there is not sufficient popular support, so it's off the table, we don't want to join NATO. And whereas they did nothing in order to popularize the idea or to. Now, according to the new poll, it's even grown to 61. So the panic has grown even. So would the president, would the parties listen to the will of their people? So, I mean, there are indications that the decision might really be positive, and I hope so very much. And that would be another repercussion of Putin's aggressiveness and his policy. But just to show that it also goes not from the top down always, but also from the bottom up, and also the societies force certain changes, especially in also in such issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thomas, would you care to answer also the general question?
Yeah, well, two previous speakers have already addressed that, but I think that, so I'll try to be very brief on that, but I think that obviously the war in Ukraine, it also raises fundamental questions about European integration. But honestly, I don't think that even the scale of this war would be sufficient to transform European Union into a state. So these things take time. And that is also probably the reason why Brendan compared 18th century United States with something like 20th century United States. So these things take time. With regard to UK, I would very much agree with Kalev on this one, because well, how do you bring in a country that's not a member of the EU? Well, obviously you would do consultations with UK, but I think it's there's also a deeper issue, because sometimes we think that, you know, if you bring a country in, if you give the country a stake in the game, then they would behave as we would like them to behave. Well, I suppose that UK with a different government in 20 years' time might do something entirely different. And we're seeing, let's say, how the previous US president treated Russia and how the US president treats Russia, and how Joe Biden refers to Vladimir Putin. But there's one thing that I would like to add to this. I think that we're all academics, and I think we're doing a lot of normative talk that we should do this and we should do that, without actually having the responsibility to do something. And so we can say things, but we don't. We will not be held responsible for whatever happens. And I think that, well, I talked about potential missed opportunities in this crisis, but I think there are also serious limits as to what we can accomplish. So, for instance, sending our troops and planes into Ukraine is probably off limits. Most academics would think that way. Most politicians think that way. So maybe they're right. Also, if we think that the best approach to Russia will always be more pressure, again, I'm not entirely sure that. Well, I would like the EU and NATO to put more pressure on Russia, and I think that's absolutely necessary. But then I think that despite the gravity of situation, we can still have reasonable debate, policy debate and academic debate about which actions might be appropriate in the present situation, and which actions might actually be counterproductive, and which actions would only kind of reinforce Russian leaders' determination to take Ukraine no matter the cost. So I think that we have gravitated towards this normative approach towards this conflict, but as academics, we should also keep in mind the explanatory approaches, things that we know already about international politics and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Toms. Margarita already started talking about these unintended consequences or potential dangers that might be associated with the current course of action. And one of these are definitely that the political leaders might be punished in the upcoming elections. Are there any other risks associated with the current strategies that would be important to consider? Margarita.
I once again want to emphasize the importance of not going to the situation back to normal. I guess it is of the utmost importance not to go at any cost to the situation back to normal. But I think that the challenge will be also for the West in general. We might be facing some very serious dilemmas. One of those dilemmas, for instance, could be we live in a liberal postmodern world in the West, and politicians and the societies, and we have certain ideas how the world works and how we should work in the world. And in order to make some transformations, at some point we will have to make sacrifices. For instance, now there is this major need to reduce the interdependency on Russia in the of the energy resources. And what the Europeans are doing, they're turning to the Gulf countries to ask whether they could fill in the need. But what they say, we have long-term contracts, and the Europeans for a long time were saying that they will be not having long-term contracts, that they will be relying on the rules of competition and effectiveness. And we don't chime in this because we have different strategies. So in order to change our path and to make the decision to provide the Europeans with energy resources, they probably have to change their policies. They have to be more open for the long-term contracts, for not economic, but political decision to get invested in the region. And I think that we will be facing more dilemmas like this. I don't have a good answer. How should we behave? Because it's a very tough choice from the postmodern values back to the modern values. And what does it say about us, about Westerners? Will this not ruin who we are, our entity? And another important dilemma would be how to compile these different threats and expectations and aspirations and develop this feeling of we-ness. making prioritization of how we act, despite that we might be seeing threats coming from the different regions. But today, this is one of the greatest threats for Europe, for our continent. So we have to just stick together and take the decisions which are necessary today. So I think that these dilemmas could be a very challenging issue for Westerners in the forthcoming years.
Thank you, Margarita. I'd like to invite others for very, very last and very brief remarks to end this discussion. Anyone would like to add something? No. Yeah, okay. So we started with a croissant, ended, we're gonna end with the cliche, every crisis is an opportunity in disguise, right? We live in a particularly challenging times, and even more challenging times lies ahead. There is a great opportunity to find more convergence, more dialogue, more strategy, but at the same time, everybody recognizes how difficult it's going to be and how many potential challenges await in the future. But trying to be hopeful, hoping that this is going to end and we'll come out stronger and more European and more together out of this. So thank you again very much for participating, for your insights and for your remarks, and I hope to see you sometime in person and invite you to come to the Institute if you have a chance. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.